students only met the first time for this workshop and had basically 6 days of them, 3 days for their work.
It
Okay.
was a good 6 days of good experiences.
Yeah.
So pretty much the following slideshows, which we're going to show you guys, is just the outcome of our online international workshop that ran for about a week. And due to the scenarios that the COVID-19 pandemic had caused, we replaced the previous field research that Miodrag presented earlier with an online remote teaching class over Zoom. So if we just go to the next slide, please, Terry. So this kind of opened up an international collaboration and brought many minds together. And through this, we chose two places, the Shamshui-Po district in Hong Kong and Corona, Queens, New York. And from there, we kind of went onto the basic sort of research that kind of revolved around the demographics of the space, you know, looking at the income, the population, and the diversity around the area. So from that research as a group, we picked up that Corona Plaza and Corona in New York was very, very sort of diverse compared to Shamshui-Po. And not only in that, also with the public spaces and the spaces around. So if we go into the next slide. Sweet. You can just see an overview, a visual overview of where the large parks and public spaces, and as well as the type of buildings are sort of splayed around the areas that we chose to research with. So if we could just move forward onto the New York City Corona Plaza, which is another part of our research. Just two more slides. Sweet. So the focus of this research then shifted from that initial research to a kind of phase where we wanted to review how these spaces were made, and that kind of led us into the NGO side of the public plaza, specifically in New York for this case, where you've got the New York City Department of Transport as well as the Queens Museum who come in to facilitate this, and eventually gets taken over by local non-government organizations which help run events and sort of push the cultural identity of the space and these open plazas. So what that there kind of enabled us to do was kind of analyze the space and kind of just look deeper, which will happen in the next slide. So one of these diagrams here is kind of just a way as a group we used to identify the different ways the public spaces used before the pandemic. So as you can see, it was quite open. It was used for public space for families to socialize, music, as well as showing off cultures and sort of exercises and other events that kind of just bring the whole community together. So if we just go into the next page, please, Terry. So these are the sort of policies that were in play in New York when the pandemic happened. So non-essential gatherings were obviously postponed, you know, social distancing, public individuals should always adhere to those rules. And also it was only applicable for essential workers to kind of go out. So all of these public spaces were kind of left empty in a way. For something that brings the community together, it was quite, you know, it's not a good thing to leave it empty, even though it would spread. So if we could just go into the next page, this is kind of a overview of how the space was used during the pandemic, and it was used as a place of protest to kind of bring to fruition the immigrant rights that needed to be happening within these spaces, as well as a sort of place for gathering of prayer and sort of just to pay tribute to the people who died during the COVID-19 pandemic in this sort of small, close community in Corona. So if we just go into the next page. So just more research on the NGOs involved during the COVID pandemic. And this page here kind of just outlines how all of the NGOs help. So I think the next page goes into a little bit more detail on what they did during the pandemic, as you've got this sort of C19 help squad, the careers, which was Corona Careers, and they kind of help deliver prescriptions and food to people for restaurants and stuff like that there. So you've got a whole bunch of non-government organizations helping out in Corona Plaza in New York, quite specifically, is what we found out. And it was quite sort of, everyone was kind of helping each other. And if we move on to the next page, just kind of prompted us to look more into these issues. Sorry, one more page after that, and come up with solutions for some of the issues that were going on. So one solution, because of the sort of immigrant community there and the sort of price they had to pay for food as they had to keep working and everything, was possibly local food banks where NGOs could kind of donate food to the community over there on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, and just allow people to kind of get the necessities they need without putting extra financial pressure on them. Another idea we had was on the next page to kind of help open up the sort of local street vendors who are in this area selling their wares, as that was the only way for them to generate income. So a rotating market of sorts where it's spaced out perfectly fine, and different vendors can come in and use these spaces and rotate around these spaces about every 2 to 3 days, just to allow them to kind of gain some sort of income. Another thing that was quite prevalent in Corona was the overcrowding of the spaces, and that there kind of prompted us to look into modular housing, as that there would be a good way to kind of prefabricate off-site and then bring it on-site for the residents to kind of alleviate the overcrowding, which also helps alleviate the spread of the virus. So with that there, I'll leave the next part onto Terry, where we explored the Sham Shui Po district in Hong Kong.
Yeah, and in Shanxi, we focus on the homeless people. In 80 districts in Hong Kong, there are the most street sleepers. In Shanxi, we found that we can prefer those people prefer stay and sleep at parks and overnight fast food restaurants. These people's life are related to the public spaces very closely, and we marked the facility and the public spaces of those homeless people need to use. Some of these spaces were closed during the pandemic, and those people's lives were affected. Amy from NGO mentioned in our workshop lecture that some immediate service for those homeless people were provided by self-funded organizations in their own communities, such as support from churches and the local food stores and schools. However, mismatches of services provided by the funded NGO during the pandemic. As most of the problem from the homeless would be related to the shelter and the hygiene and food provision during the pandemic, so therefore we propose some measure to increase its resilience level of these spaces, including at some mobile shelters and facilities in order to adapt to the need for the homeless people. And we also propose that the government and funded NGOs can work together to reduce the impact of measures to control the pandemic on those homeless people. Yeah, that's all of our presentation. Thank you.
Sweet.
Okay.
And I also just want to add to that really quickly. It was a really interesting experience to kind of work with students internationally and get that opportunity. There was a lot of different mindsets coming into it, and it was actually a very useful tool to kind of further our own education.